Okay, I suppose I'm in charge of the timing here, so I'll declare that the next session is open. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce Ann Rigney, who I'm sure is well known to all of you for wide varieties of work in memory studies from a literary and historical perspective. Her most, probably wrong by now, but the last book of yours I read is the book on Walter Scott, which is a tremendously interesting, informative, and theoretically generative book that develops a dialogic approach to memory, as well as illuminating an absolutely fascinating case. I myself have learned a tremendous amount from Ann's work on multi-directional, transnational, traveling, and similar concepts of memory, and I'm looking very much forward to her talk. So without further ado.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thank you to the organizer for having me here. It's a tremendous honor to be here, and I'm also very much looking forward to it as a big learning experience, because I've already heard that there's been a discussion going on for the last years, and I'm sort of stepping in. It's like you arrive at the party, it's 11 o'clock, and everybody's already drunk, and you arrive, right? So that's what I feel like today, right? So much already has been said, also this morning about the question of regions. So I'm hoping that I can just add a little bit to this discussion, and perhaps a different perspective. Let's see if I can get this going. So my starting point is the idea that in memory studies, that if you like, nation bashing has been a popular pastime. I think we can date back to the beginning of the 1980s, a critique of the nation as the only or the most self-evident or the natural framework for memory. And usually this is related to the work of Pierre Nora. Les Lunes Mémoires is the most quoted book as a milestone in memory studies, and there's no doubt it's been extremely influential. But I'd like to draw your attention to another book which I find more important theoretically for memory studies, and that is Anderson's Imagined Communities, already mentioned this morning. And since Anderson's Imagined Communities is more often quoted than actually read, I just want to sum up a couple of his main points in his argument. The first one is the fact that Anderson puts remembering and forgetting at the heart of nation building. He talks about nationalism as a new way of linking fraternity, power, and time. So fraternity, power, and time being linked together, and linking people together on the basis of an affiliation with the idea of a continuous historical tradition. So that's the first point, this idea of linking fraternity, time, and power. The second one is the idea, which is very important to me as a media and cultural scholar, is the fact that media, and particularly in Anderson's argument, newspapers and the novel, have been essential to providing the conditions for the emergence of these imagined communities. And the third point, which is one I really want to dwell on a little bit, has to do with the idea that he not only posits the nation as continuous in time, but it's key to the idea of a nation is the idea of its being limited. And here's a quote from Anderson. The nation is imagined as limited. Maybe that's a good idea. Yeah, you can see that. Oh, that's smart. Yeah. The nation is imagined as limited because even the largest of them, encompassing perhaps 1 billion living human beings, is finite. Perhaps has finite, if elastic, boundaries beyond which lie other nations. No nation imagines itself as coterminous with mankind, except the French. But there is implicitly this notion that, this was not Anderson, by the way, okay, no nation imagines itself as coterminous with mankind. This is something I want you to remember, because we're going to fast forward 30 years or so, and we'll see that this reflexivity regarding the nation has turned into a full-scale desire to go beyond methodological nationalism in the humanities and the social sciences, and this has already been mentioned extensively today. I think there's been a growing realization that a transnational perspective is necessary if we are to better grasp the flows of information and the flows of people in the contemporary world. And so we can see in the last years a proliferation of terms to try and help us to grasp those complexities, including cosmopolitan memory, memory in a global age, globatal memory, transcultural memory, and the term I prefer myself, transnational memory. Now, I'm just flagging these as just to indicate this debate, and the important thing is to not to at this point to go into the differences between these concepts, but just to indicate this common concern with finding new frameworks for studying memory in the post-national era. And I use the word post-national here like we use the word post-colonial, not to say that nations are no longer important or that nationalism isn't important, because it is extremely important still, but rather that, like the post-colonial, we're living in an age where we also have things in addition to the nation, and we have alternatives to it. Now, most of the studies I'm mentioning here, and it's already been flagged before, are based on the idea that, this beyond methodological nationalism will bring us into a sort of blue skies situation, into the idea that there's no limits anymore. And the idea of being liberated and being unbound is a term that continuously recurs. I just refer here to Levi and Schneider's article from 2002. It's called about memory unbound. There's a new book about to appear edited by Steph Krapps called Memory Unbound. And even in Astrid Earle's key article on traveling memory, already quoted, she talks about traveling memory, and she uses it synonymously with transcultural memory, is not bound, she says. It's continuously moving beyond and across territorial and social borders. Now, I'm very, very sympathetic to the idea of moving beyond methodological nationalism, and that's how I take our agenda here today. However, I'm a bit concerned about this idea that the horizon is situated so far away, that it's situated in the idea of the global and even more recently in the planetary, because that's a horizon you're not going to bump into very soon. It's very, very far away, and it's almost like an idea. I'm also troubled by the idea of thinking about the world as a single thing, as homogeneous and as seamless, and as if there's flows, even flows across even territory. Because I think we need to think more about the idea of borders. And here, just an example of a very clear example of borders existing in Europe today. And I think Europe has created more borders than that it has dissolved borders in many different ways. And these borders are material borders, and they're also imagined borders. In our discussion of so far about regions, this is what I think to be the most crucial idea. The region brings back into this discussion of globalization the idea of the finite, the idea of a threshold, the idea of a border. And this seems to me the most crucial thing that we should think about. Not so much the idea of extending memory like a big oil spill which continues on, flows across the whole world, but rather think about this question of the border and the threshold and put that at the center of our concerns. And to think about shifting borders. When do imagined borders shift, and when do they refuse to shift? And so we start at that point of the encounter, the interfaces between 2 points of difference, rather than thinking about the idea of extension. And that's what I've been trying to do in this book I edited a couple of years ago with my anthropologist colleague, Chiara De Cesari. We've put the idea of not only of circulation of memory, but also the idea of articulation at the center of our concerns. And for those of you who are not native speakers of English, let me explain that the word articulation has two meanings. And the fact that I have to explain this already says something about linguistic specificity in memory studies, which was raised before the break, and I think it's very important. But articulation means two things in English. It means, in the first instance, the idea of connecting two different things, as in the idea of an articulated truck. Articulated truck is made up of two things which are brought together. And I'm interested in this bringing of the two things together. That's articulation. And the cultural theorist Stuart Hall in the 1970s talked about articulation as being a strategy within society of people joining forces, as it were, making alliances, and this is what he calls articulation. I'm particularly interested in that, linked to the second aspect of articulation, that is expression. We talk about articulation meaning in making clear sounds, in connecting sounds in order to make sense, right? It's about expression. And the question for me as a cultural scholar is to ask, how does expression, how does talking about the past, how does telling stories about the past, how does that create new connections? So how does this work of articulation take place? And in that, I'm interested in the idea particularly of articulation in the terms of what Michael Rothberg talks about as being unscripted linkages. He talks about the fact that we have scripted linkages, patterns of identification which are traditional, for which we have scripts. And then we have unscripted linkages. These are points of innovation when a new connection has been made. So in what follows, I'm going to talk about different forms of articulation, try and flesh that concept out a little bit for you, but also with a particular emphasis on these ideas of new points of articulation, the unscripted linkages. And that means, if you think about articulation, the first thing that you have to think about is the idea of connectivity. And here I realize that I'm of the speakers so far, I'm the first one to come from cultural studies and media studies. And for somebody working in my discipline, mediation, media, communication is a center of our concerns. Everybody has a professional deformation. Mine is that I look at the world from the perspective of communication and mediation. And if we do that, we begin to get the idea of articulation. The first instance is connectivity. It's a question of who's talking to whom. And I think that comes, if we're thinking about memory studies, we can think about the sharing of memory as somebody is talking to somebody else, or somebody's writing to somebody else, or somebody's communicating to with somebody else. So we could think about the memory scapes in terms of connectivity. And what I have here, and I don't know if it's come out very clear, is this idea of communication networks. And this might be an alternative to more geographical understandings of regions, maybe coming back to Simon's idea of constellations. Here we have communication networks. What actually you have here is flight paths across Europe, which I think is the equivalent of movement of information. It's like movement of airplanes, and we're all familiar with that from the airplanes. You open the book to see where you're going, and you see all these flight paths. Well, these are flight paths which lead not so much to containers, regions, but to hubs, points where people come together. So that's the first important thing about this idea of connectivity. And the second one, so you can see Europe here in this map, and it's a world map. You can see Europe is constituted by the fact that there's so many exchanges. There's so many flights passing over it. And presumably what could be done at the European level could also could be done at the local level, where you see the types of connections and communications at a local, in a cityscape or in a national scape, or in other types of configurations. And so the idea of connectivity allows us to approach these issues from different scales, right? We have different scales of analysis. It could be very local, confined, or it could be broader. To give you a sense of what that local, how connectivity can create a a space of communication. Let me just give you another example, and this is from some of the visualization of networks done by my colleague Joep Leersen in Amsterdam in his Encyclopedia of Romantic Nationalism. And what you see here is the communication network of the French writer and intellectual Prosper Mérimée. And you see that it's very much concentrated in the area of Paris and to southwest Europe, right? So, but if you compare that with his colleague, almost a contemporary, Moritz Arndt from Germany, you see that his communication network is much more directed towards the northeast, or northwest, northeast. So here you get two different, as it were, communication networks which are being established. And the point of Joep Leersen's project is to show, in fact, how different regions are being constructed in similar ways. But the point here is the idea that at the level of individual activists, you can also circumscribe, you can see how regions are created through acts of communication. Okay? So that's the first thing I want you to recall. And now what I want to do is look at the question of articulation, not just in the sense of you are in contact with somebody, but along the question of what are you talking about? And what I want to now do is to go in, give you some examples of the different types of articulation which occur, both in the making of stories, narratives, and in the circulation of stories. So I've got, and as you'll see, many of my examples, or most of my examples, come from the realm of the arts, because my hidden agenda behind this is to persuade you of the role of the arts in actually being catalysts of articulation, right? In bridging and breaching borders. So the first type I want of articulation I want to talk about is what I would call integrative remembrance. And here I'm thinking about stories which are told about conflicts and resolution. And my example here is taken, my main example here would be taken from the 19th century Ivanhoe, Walter Scott. Many of you will know this work, a global bestseller. And what's interesting here is that it's about the birth of the British nation based on a story about a conflict between the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, and the idea is that they fight with each other, and at the end of the story they live happily ever after and you found a new nation, right? This is a model which we find exported as one of these traveling templates which goes through Europe and into North America, and we see it as a traveling template which is used in nation building. And the point here I would like to flag is the fact that nation building itself is based on all of these articulations and in the fact that you integrated different regions through creating imagined stories whereby people imagine themselves as, if not having a common origin, at least having a common birth. The birth of the nation is shared by all parties. A more recent example of this would be North and South, that blockbuster American television series, which you probably know, which is, again, it's an attempt to imagine a world where the North and South in the United States are combined in some way. Now, this idea of integration suggests that it's always, you know, a question of equality between the two parties. Of course, it isn't. In many cases, you have these type of integrative narratives which are based on the subordination of one group to a dominant group. I'm not going to go into that details now. The Belgian case is an interesting one. The Belgian writer Hendrik de Conscience imitated Scott, but by creating a story about Flemings and French, but instead of it turning out to be reconciliation between the two, the story is actually a recipe for considering the domination of the Flemish. So there's different variations on this. The point, however, is that stories are about imagining the meeting and the binding and the blending or the subordination of different groups. Okay. And I want us to see this issue of of articulation as something which has been going on for a long time. It's not something that we're now starting to do. Now, the second one I want to type of integration here I want to talk about is that of multi-directional remembrance. And Michael Rothberg's wonderful work on multi-directional memory has already been referred to. For those of you who don't know it, it's important to realize that it's that a central argument is the fact that that one group story can help another group story to be expressed, to come into expression. And the example that he uses is the case of the Holocaust, providing a model for the narrating the story of slavery and of colonization. And his argument is that two different stories can mutually inspire each other, because the issue is, how do you bring things to expression? How do you articulate them? And here he's showing how in the act of articulation you're also breaking down the compartments between people who are not entangled, who are not part of an entangled history in any direct sense. Now, sometimes this principle of multidirectionality is simply implicit in a story which is told. And my example here might be, again, a 19th century example, is a very curious text from 1914 called Uncle Pat's Cabin, which is an Irish version of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's clearly an attempt to write the history of Irish enslavement by the British using the model of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is therefore implicit, as it were, in this new novel, in this new work. However, what you also see happening is that you find, particularly in the late 20th century, all sorts of experiments in the form of storytelling, experiments which are designed to not integrate two groups into the same story, which is the classical version, but to interlace stories. And this example here was one also given by Rothberg, Carl Phillips, The Nature of Blood, where it's a novel written in 1997, where Carl Phillips talks on one storyline is about a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, and another storyline is about Othello, in fact, the Moorish prince in the Shakespeare play, and Phillips fantasizes about this, so it's a fictional, but it's a fiction which is designed clearly to show how the history of racism in Europe in relation to Africa is, in a sense, mirrored and resonates with the history of anti-Semitism. So here you see how in this multi-directional process, as it were, stories start talking to each other. Now, the third type of articulation that is this case of what I call hetero-remembrance. I couldn't find a better term than this. It's perhaps a minor practice, but I think it's a significant one. The fact that we very often find people writing about other people's stories. And a lot of our theorizing in memory studies is all from the inside. It's about how do groups tell their own stories. But the fact of the matter is, quite often we see people writing other people's stories. And the most immediate example that comes to mind, if you like, is the recent BBC televisation of War and Peace. I don't know if you've seen it. All these Russians speaking English, as if that's quite normal. But so here you see sort of Tolstoy being adapted for an English audience. We can ask, what's in it for the British? What's it doing in that sense of perhaps shifting the mental horizons of the British? And now it's, of course, this also televisation is now is being shown in Holland, so we're getting it all mixed up, all these different nationalities. But it's not, this is a recent and perhaps trivial example. More interesting ones would be, for example, Wojciech's movie on Danton. Again, a Polish filmmaker talking about a French revolutionary. He's fitting in a tradition there, going back to earlier plays about Danton and thinking of Buchner's in 1830 writing about Danton. So Germans writing about, or Polish writing about Danton, you could say, well, why do you have this sort of border crossing? And the answer might be, well, those people didn't consider there to be a border. It's all about a common humanity. It's about a common struggle, revolutionary struggle. But that in itself is something which is the outcome of the story itself. It's something which is created by the story. Other examples which I find very interesting is the Lydia Cordulas, the Estonian writer, writing in 1870 about the Judith, the Last Maroons of Jamaica, which is about slavery in Jamaica, and it's being read in Estonia, according to a recent study, as being a comment on Estonian sort of oppression by multiple others at this time. So here we see how then multi-directionality comes back into play again, but as a feature of the reception of such a work, that you have a story being told and then it's being interpreted and then connected in that interpretation to another situation. So we get an interplay between text and people, as it were. And what I'm trying to get us towards as well is this idea that we don't have to think about media just as in terms of media artifacts, but they're also used by people, made by people, people react to them. And so I think we need a more integrative approach to them. Which brings me to the next type of articulation, which is circulation. And this is very close to Astradare's idea of traveling memory. It's literally how information travels. So it's different from imagining it, staying at home and imagining it. This is about actual texts, movies, which move themselves. And so this is, so we have things which are actually moving across borders. And I have a rather anecdotal case which I found so fascinating I had to tell you, but I give it to you, but I couldn't place it quite in my scheme, but I'll try to. I'll call it transposition. And this comes back to a trip I made to Barcelona for pleasure last year at a time just on the eve of the recent unofficial referendum. And since all the Catalonian independence was in the air, I of course went to the local city museum to find out more about the history of Barcelona and Catalonia. And all very interesting. And what do I find here? I find this exhibition called Latvia, the Fight for Freedom. There was no comment whatsoever as to what Latvia, the Fight for Freedom, a whole exhibition, which was about 1989. And lots of very interesting, all about Latvia, but it was in Barcelona, right? So here we're having something that was transposed literally from Latvia to Barcelona. No comments on it, but clearly, you could put two and two together. It wasn't very subtle in terms of the framework. It wasn't very subtle, but nevertheless incredibly fascinating as to how, at one point of Europe, you're in Barcelona, you're actually imagining and patterning your own history and your own future in relation to somewhere quite very far away, relatively far away in Latvia. So this is what I would call transposition, and I think this way in which exhibitions move is very interesting in that regard. The exhibition of Anne Frank, for example, has moved around the globe and has connected with local histories in a very interesting way. Okay, the other one is translation, a more obvious one. Translation. The fact that stories are often translated, and one of my a novel I find absolutely fascinating on the Spanish Civil War is Soldades de Salamina from 2002, if I'm right, by Javier Cercas, and it has been translated into 14 European languages as well as Japanese. So what I want us to think about is, why do other people, why are they interested in finding out about Spain? And you could look at the dissemination of this story to say what does it mean when it arrives in Japan or when it arrives in Greece, for example. Another example might be given of Orhan Pamuk's wonderful novel Snow, which is about set in eastern Anatolia with lots of reference to the remainders of the Armenian culture in eastern Anatolia, which again has been translated into 19 languages, including Japanese and Chinese. Dubrava Ugreja's novel on the falling apart of Yugoslavia. It's a wonderful novel. I can highly recommend it to you, called The Museum of Unconditional Surrender, written in Serbo-Croatian. It's only been published, it's been translated into 4 languages, and then of course the question, why is there, in one case do we have 14, in the other one only 4? This could be a very complicated story in its own right, but I suggest it also has to do with institutional factors about promoting certain books and certain writers. Like Pamuk is such a big guy, no matter what he writes, it'll always be translated, whereas Ugrezic is in a different category. When I was preparing this talk and seeing, numbers of translations, I had to ask myself, well, is it only fictional works which are translated? And I was trying to suggest my argument would be, but I have to prove that in a more study, that there's more fictional works which are translated. But I have to admit that when I looked up Bloodlands, I found have been translated into 20 different languages. So this gives me, I would be very interested in feedback as to why that is, and because it's very unusual, it seems to me, for a non-fiction work to have that type of reach. Okay. Dissemination, subtitling, again, the same story more or less could be said about the dissemination of, or the distribution with subtitles, so sort of subtitle memory. So as you've translated memory, of subtitle memory of the movie Katyn, which has been distributed into 30 European countries, 30 countries, including non-European ones. Greengrass's Bloody Sunday, I'll be coming back to Bloody Sunday in a moment, in 33 countries, and Terra Firma, a recent movie from 2011 on migrants in the Mediterranean, has been distributed in 28 countries. So again, this is would have to be, again, supplemented by notion who was watching it, how many people saw it, and so on. But just as an indication of interest, that's what I want to flag here. As an indication of interest, it suggests that particularly fiction has a power of generating what Alison Landsberg talks about as prosthetic memory, this idea of an extension of your, as it were, inherited memory through the mediation of cinema. Giving us this capacity to identify or affiliate ourselves with strangers, which of course was the basis of Anderson's idea of the nation. The nation is a way of affiliating yourself with strangers, and in his case it was the novel and newspapers which were so important. Already, however, I would want to note there's a difference in the distribution of these particular movies. I was very struck by the fact that Terra Firma, the Italian movie on the recent migrant crisis, has not been widely distributed at all in Central and East Europe. It's as if it hasn't come into this communicative space, as it were, whereas, and this is perhaps more predictable, the movie Katyn has been distributed extremely widely, particularly in East and Central Europe, but also outside, also in Brazil, Argentina, and so on. So what we're getting here is a combination of scripted linkages based often on contiguity and entangled histories, but also unscripted linkages which which perhaps are the outcome of the presence of the movie. And I think mapping the unequal distribution of these products would be extremely interesting. And I think in this regard, memory studies could learn a lot from translation studies and from transnational reception studies, where the question is asked how, and I'm quoting here from Jan Ramasani, how receiving cultures or receiving publics negotiate, accept, indigenize, resist, and transform foreign influences. So this would have to be followed up by looking at how people actually transform and interpret and indigenize these traveling movies and stories. Okay. This is the end of my survey of different types of articulation. I hope it's become clear by now that narratives, both in the way they're composed and also in the way they're distributed, that they can be agents in the creation of new linkages. They create relations between different mnemonic communities. I think we were thinking about how different that those relations may be of different types. They may be of mirroring, sameness, or it may be in relation to alliance on the basis of some sort of empathy. There's different types of relations which can be established, and I think a more deeper analysis would have to show that. And then that would also have to include the question of agonism, the idea of the other, that a story, a narrative which is imported may be also reinforcing a notion of the otherness of another group. So these are details we would have to go into. However, what I want to do now is to move ahead and ask ourselves about the electronic media and how the electronic media might change this type, what I'm showing here. If print media and let's say cinema, to the kind of the broadcast medium is close to print medium, is the medium par excellence of nation building, how does electronic media, how does that relate to these emerging types of solidarities and constellations that we are discussing here? Now, the question of the electronic media is so enormous, I can't pretend to deal with it in any detail, and of course it's an emerging issue within memory studies itself, and I'm thinking here of work by Andrew Hoskins, by José van Dijk, by Anna Rigney. Most of what's been said so far about the digital media has been about the question of storage and about the nature of digitization as a storage medium. Or it's been focused on particular websites, how websites are constructed and worked. All of that very, very interesting. However, what I want to zoom in now is one particular phenomenon, which is a product of the electronic age, and which I don't think has received the attention it deserves, and yet it's extremely important for memory studies, and that is Wikipedia. So what is Wikipedia? We all use it all the time. So what sort of work of articulation does Wikipedia engage in, and how do we analyze such a new object? It's a new object of analysis. And it's not been studied, it's been studied in some, there's been a couple of studies on it as a medium of cultural memory, but it's been still very limited. Now, I chose Wikipedia because I happen to think it's quite an extraordinary phenomenon. It's like building the pyramids in the space of 10 years, it seems. You think it's only been there for 15 years at most. To think of all that's there, it's quite extraordinary. But what Wikipedia is it's what's called a media dispositive. It's not just it works as an apparatus, as it were, which brings together technology, media technology, cultural formats, and a system of governance. And the technology, of course, linked to the idea of the possibility of having hyperlinks and of people adding content to it. And the cultural format has to do with, and you're familiar with, the sort of certain structure of articles. They have a common structure, common possibilities. And there's a system of governance which you may not be so aware of, the fact that it's the possibility of editing it, and if you can actually follow the different edits, and colleagues at the University of Amsterdam have been working on tools to try and analyze the pattern of editing. Unfortunately, it's only restricted to one language, English, so it's still difficult to do the type of analysis I find particularly interesting. But you have a system of governance which is based on the principle of consensus. So the idea is that there's editors who to ensure that the content never deviates too far from what is acceptable in terms of what has been sourced and what is clearly not just a question of partisanship. And if you look at the edit histories, you'll see how, for example, in the case I'd be looking at, which is to do with the city of Derry in Northern Ireland, which some people call Londonderry, you can see flurries of Londonderry, and within the space of an hour it can keep changing. And this has to do with the contribution both of bots who pick up on the changes and editors who then react to the changes. So there's a whole system of governance behind Wikipedia, which is very interesting. However, what I'm particularly interested here is the idea that it's a global phenomenon, this idea that's multilingual, that there's so many different versions of the same articles. That people are talking, not only talking about the same thing in the same platform, as it were, but they're talking about the same topics. If you take the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, there was 104 articles on the fall of the Berlin Wall, 104 languages involved in the fall of the Berlin Wall, including Swahili, which is very unusual because, by and large, Wikipedia doesn't go into Africa. And all of the studies of digital media will keep showing a digital divide with Africa in darkness. But now and again, you find articles from, for example, Swahili. What you find, so African languages are underrepresented, but interestingly, minority languages are overrepresented. You'll find Celtic languages, which are very minor in their political importance, are there all over the place. But you'll also find a lot of articles, for example, in Tatar and in other languages which are not state languages, but which cross the borders between different countries. Also, Esperanto is very present. So you've got, what you see here is a sort of a global convergence on the English language articles, which are the most used and the most widely providing the most wide coverage, and this sort of indigenization, this sort of sense that it's a platform also where you can display your identity as a Breton or as a Tatar. So it's this idea, what I'm interested in here is in the light of our notion of sort of going beyond methodological nationalism, is how these sort of, it's global and indigenized, localized at the same time. And, you know, sometime in the future, hopefully we'll have bigger scale studies of the ways, the distribution of different points of interest across these different language areas. Already it's obvious to me that there is, you know, different patterns of in the distribution of interest for certain topics. I was very interested in these, the case of as so many other people were, in the case of Alan Kurdi, which you might recall was that poor, unfortunate Syrian boy whose photograph was hit the media. The photograph of his dead body hit the media last fall, and there are now 28 articles on this young boy, about whom we know not very much, a little bit, but not very much. But it was interesting there that there was such, of the 25 articles I found on this particular boy, that 17 of them were non-European. And only 8 of them were European. So there you saw that there was a clearly distinct, the ratio was different in the case, for example, again, of the case of Katyn. If you look at it, you'll find that there are 57 different articles on Katyn, but there's no fewer than 20 Eastern European languages involved in this. So again, these are these distributions which might provide a different type of evidence for convergence in different regions. However, it's also clear that these convergences are not based only on territorial or geographical contiguity, but also on what in network theory people talk about as these sort of weak ties. You get interest from other parts of the world which are in these unscripted linkages based on the principle of hetero-remembrance, the idea of it's happening there, it's happening far away, and nevertheless it's of interest to us here, right? Okay, so what I want to do just in the final part of this talk is to present to you a case study that I carried out on a case study which is on Bloody Sunday 1972, and it's a case study carried out with one of my graduate students, Hannah Ackermans, and our idea was to see how was this story picked up and what were the differences in the different versions of it, in order to see if we could bring a sort of a profile into the idea of global spread. Bloody Sunday 1972, many of you will recall, refers to an incident in Northern Ireland in 1972 when protesters, peaceful protesters, demonstrators for civil rights were shot, killed by members of the British Army. And this is a very important site of memory in Northern Ireland, but also Ireland, and it turns out elsewhere too. And I've written about it extensively from all different angles, and in this case we were interested what's happening in the case of Wikipedia. And there's 43 different articles on Wikipedia on Bloody Sunday. Which is amazing when you think it's a small, local, very, very localized event taking place in a small town in Northern Ireland. So 43 different articles. And Hannah and I looked at 20 different versions of them, crowdsourcing all the linguistic skills among our fellow students and colleagues, and compared them, and they came up with the following preliminary conclusions. And the first one, an obvious point, is the difference in length, right? The length of the articles vary from the English article, which is 6,000 words, to the German one is only 1,600 words, and is 200 words in Norwegian. So you just so what you're going to see is a pattern of degree of interest, and it seems interesting to think about the relationship of this in this connectivity in terms of degree of interest. The second thing we noticed was the question of emotive distance, that the distance in terms of degree of involvement. I mentioned at the beginning that Wikipedia tends to gravitate towards the idea of consensus, right? And you see corrections constantly taking place. If somebody used the word massacre, for example, in the English version, that's edited out. But that type of more strongly evaluative and judgmental language you'll find in the Dutch version and in the Swedish version, more so than you'll find in the English version. In other words, that at a certain distance, people are actually more judgmentally involved, more emotively involved, than the closer you are to it, if you take the English as a measure of closeness. That involvement then peters off if you go to the Japanese and Chinese versions. And it seemed to me interesting to think of a sort of how do you map this type of involvement, this type of emotional engagement. It would be interesting to map that. A sort of topography of engagement. The third point we notice is that while you have a continuity in the okay, here we are, where you have a continuity in the cultural points of reference, and one of the features of Wikipedia is that it includes many references to popular culture and entertainment as clearly points of access for the general public to a particular event, that these point of references are maintained across all the different articles, particularly as this involves movies and music. The U2 Sunday Bloody Sunday turns out to be present in all of the articles, but theatre and poetry doesn't travel in the same way. That was interesting to notice. And what we also noticed was that the addition of local points of inflection in the new articles, so that there's a French rapper who's mentioned in the French text. There's Joseph Beuys is referenced in the German text. And so therefore you see how it's being indigenized, as it were, and adapted to the new circumstance. And this also affects the sources which are used. And finally, and the last point, is this idea of unscripted linkages, the idea that you have these analog producing portals. You'll recall that at the end of most or of all Wikipedia articles, you have the categories to which this event belongs, right? And it was very interesting to see the different range of categories which were used to describe the same event. Most interesting of this would be, for example, that the Italian categorizes it under, and unfortunately you can't really see it here, but one of the categories used in the Italian case is the state terrorism. And if you then click through state terrorism, you come out into a whole series of Italian events relating to the so-called lead years of the 1970s in Italy. If you look through the the French case, you'll find the idea of massacres in the United Kingdom, which is an interesting category. And that brings you by 2 degrees of separation to the massacre of Algerian demonstrators in Paris 1961. And similarly, if you go through to the German one, massacre, you come out to Srebrenica and to Amritsar. So you're only, from one story, very quickly you're into another set of events. And to begin with, if you start even searching for Bloody Sunday, you'll find that it's already part of a whole list of different Bloody Sundays. And that's how I started, and I've actually studied the ways in which this concept of Bloody Sunday has traveled from all of these through these different versions. But when I showed this, gave this presentation on that particular topic in Dublin, everybody was surprised. No, there is only one Bloody Sunday. It's our Bloody Sunday. He said, okay, all you do is type in Wikipedia and you'll find out, you're not alone out there, which can be a mix, which can be sort of a mixed blessing, right? Our exceptionality is gone, but also this possibility of linking into other stories. Okay, so just to round up there, what I'm trying to suggest to you here is that what we have here is a very new phenomenon, which is deterritorialized, but at the same time it's very much a site for the production of new types of memory, new types of communication between the local and the global, and for the generation of new types of linkages, new types of analogies, on the basis of comparison on the basis of comparison, but which may, if you pursue them further, may also lead to different types of connections. Of course, the real question for all of this is what encourages you to start looking? What encourages you to start clicking through? And this is, I think, something that we really have to get a hold of. What the subjectivities behind memory and the subjectivities behind this sort of curiosity and wanting to follow the links, because they're definitely there. So let me just offer a couple of points of reflection by way of conclusion of this sort of wide-ranging survey. What I've been trying to do, above all, is to highlight the role of the media and the arts in articulating memories, in establishing different types of connections between strangers at sometimes very considerable distance. So the question, we have to rethink this notion of distance. And I think what emerges here is a notion of a topography of memory, which is very different from just that notion of sort of different containers, smaller or larger, lined up on a flat world model, as it were, which we often use to talk about memory. And in this topography of memory, we're dealing with different types of relations of contiguity, but also these sort of relations which are imagined relations, which are mediated. And in talking about mediation, I've been trying to emphasize the generative and dynamic aspects of memory cultures as being based in communication. And I don't want, of course, ignore the fact that memories can stick, and the sticking to memories is also a very important part of memory cultures. And nevertheless, I think it's worth considering, and I think it's not more than worth considering, it's important for us to consider also the different ways in which memory can change. How do we reinvent memory? How is memory reinvented? And what is the role played by the arts and the media in those sort of communications in reinventing memory? A reinvention which takes place at the small scale, as it were, of the individual viewer or reader, but which, through these types of effects, can actually have much bigger implications. Because it seems to me thinking about how memory changes is extremely important and has become all the more important as we are called upon to learn to live with strangers. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. We'll take some questions, well, I guess we'll accumulate them, but I'm going to exploit the privilege of having the microphone in my hand to just make a comment that we've been directing our attention to one of the big problems of the field, the risk of methodological nationalism. I think underlying much of what Anne had to say is another one of these reifications is the risk of methodological individualism when we're talking about memory. We use the word memory, we think about, oh, can I remember my phone number or how to get from one place to another, a very individual process. But what Anne is talking about is memory as symbols and meanings and narratives about the past, which can be internalized and subjective, but also can be externalized and objectified, and that the patterns and structures and topographies of these symbols, narratives, and meanings about the past have a lot to do with processes that are not neurological or psychological, but also cultural and medial and sociological. So I think that that point is worth articulating. So we'll hand around the microphone and gather some questions or comments.
Thank you for this very interesting speech. I've got a question because you were talking about cultural artifacts, let's say, but within academia it's observable just there is also the discussion and some kind of transfers of, I would call it the transfers of some ideas which we're using to describe some historical events, and then we are starting on the base of academia arguing whether we should use the same terminology to describe the other ideas. I will use the most common example, so the Holocaust, and calling the Holocaust the genocide, and then the usage of the word the genocide to describe, for example, the slaughters of Armenians in 1915. So I just want to ask you for your opinions about this transfer of ideas and terms within memory studies and broader as well. Thanks.
Yeah. How do you want to do this, Jeff? Collect questions? Yeah.
Do you want to respond individually?
Well, maybe I can try. Yeah. Or did yours connect with this? Why don't you ask a question? Yeah.
Oh, no, but okay.
Sure, please ask.
Thank you for your speech. I would like to ask you something about the social media, your opinion, because now we have a new type of journalists, I would say, bloggers. Yeah. We have another interplay there with comments, with a new articulation of memories. Is there a study or something about that on the matter?
Okay, thank you. Maybe I can answer that one first and then come back to your question. The short answer is yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of study in social media. The book I think is the best one to look at is José van Dijk's Cultures of Connectivity. Okay. Came out 2 years ago, which is very good in just giving the sort of explaining how these things work. It's not specific about memory, and I think you'd have to, for the memories, there's a number. Andrew Hoskin would be somebody to look at. I can sort of think in the next few hours of some more. Okay. But the thing is that the jury is still out on this social media, right? It's clear that we have, on the one hand, this idea of participatory culture, and I think this is something that we really have to think about in terms of all forms of memory production, because of the loss, if you like, of the authority of institutions, at least in the public discourse, in the relationship, in the idea that people should know themselves what they want, right? And that the social media are so-called the place for this greater democratization. Yeah. So there's a whole sort of utopian story, which now is getting becoming increasingly criticized, because that's not the way it seems to work. And then partly because, and this is where A.D. Huntsman's work on websites is very interesting. She shows how websites become these echo chambers. So the idea of exchanging across communities is in fact diminished rather than advanced by the presence of these social media. And that's why I was particularly interested in Wikipedia, because it's outside of that type of dynamic. So yes, so lots to be said on that one. Yeah. Question of the terms. Yes, I think when we're dealing with all of culture is always on the move, right? And the culture Astor talks about traveling memory. I think there's also based on James Clifford's idea of traveling cultures, but there's also this idea of traveling concepts, the idea that in talking about our objects of study, we use concepts, we use language. Partly this is a question of, it came up earlier, the question of just linguistic capabilities, which words are available in which languages and what is their connotations. So I think there's always a drift when things get translated, which can be productive. But it's also very challenging to think, are you actually using the same concept when you're talking in French, for example? If you use the word memoir in French, it has a very different connotation from Erinnerung in German. And so these are issues we have to deal with. When it comes to the question of the definition of something as genocide, not genocide, this brings also into the whole political aspect of it. So there's all these different levels at play.
Thank you, Anne, for the really excellent lecture. I wanted to mark, kind of continuing the discussion that we had in the roundtable, the movement that you brought here. So there is in two directions, going towards globalization and universalization of memory, starting with the national memories or local memories, but also in regional memories. You mentioned the self-limiting, so this movement towards indigenization. This is very interesting to reflect then on. And also, do I understand well that in the way that you presented the memory and how we understand it today as multicultural, transnational, multi-directionals, etc. We are not speaking anymore so much about memory in terms of identity, as it was, especially in the case of national memories, which basically constructed the dichotomies, me or we versus the other. It is more now memory in terms of culture and participating in cultural practices. And it is in this sense more liberal and open, because I actually can decide whether I want to participate or not. So I can include or exclude myself from this culture of remembrance. Would you agree?
I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Because there's two. I think you're absolutely right. And I wish I could have written it down what you said, because I think it's opens up this perspective of the relationship. The memory itself has changed. It's not in what it does and how it functions for individuals. It's not just that we're now having different frameworks. So I think that's a really important point. Two things I think I would add to what you say is that I think the local has increased in importance in a certain way because of these bigger frameworks, and the local in terms of actual places and different performances of memory in actual places. And I think that's something which I don't talk about here because I've been talking about the media and the media traveling, but the things which don't travel are extremely important. And you could imagine that within new configurations, that city memory, for example, becomes much more important because it's part of the lived landscape that people have from day to day, and that this is creating a new type of memory, and perhaps also a new type of identity, but it's an identity which is to do with being the inhabitant of a city rather than being part of a political body or such as the nation. And I had a second point, but it's slipped my mind now. Might come back to it. Yeah.
I already have the microphone. Sorry. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the role of piracy. I found your discussion of films and electronic media very interesting. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's watched films slightly illegally. Do you have any ideas on whether or in what way memory and the sharing of narratives about the past can be legal and or controlled by commercial interests? In what way this frame of governance might affect this the transposition and the distribution of ideas about the past.
And piracy meaning that you go around the legal channels, is it?
But no comment about my own practices, but yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of, you can produce subtitles and you can download subtitles. You can, on the Russian equivalent of Facebook called Vkontakte, you can watch basically anything.
Yeah. I wasn't trying to pry in, but the question is here is about who's controlling these flows, right? And if it's something that people can take into their own hands. And of course, the fact that people can share movies makes the sort of figures that you get on channels like IMDb or on the European Cinema Network, that these of course have to be relativized, knowing that there's a lot of circulation which is going on outside of those channels. So that just complicates, as it were, the picture. The question of the commercial interest, I think, is extremely important too, and I find it extremely troubling, but it's something that has to come up, because in a certain way, I'm arguing on the one hand for the power of imagination and you sort of art to reach borders. At the same time, and I think that's the case, and I was very interested in Kate's examples earlier on. They were of artworks and of using imagination to try and to bring across a new story. At the same time, a lot of these, particularly when it comes to the cinema, a lot of it is controlled by big production companies. And so what is it, the one that's traveling? Is it the best? Talk about best practices. Is it the best version of, do we consider it as memory experts, as it were, as historians? Is this the best quality that people are getting? Because they're going for it. And this is a whole set of issues about the question, who's in charge of this media culture? The question of governance of the whole media scape is extremely difficult, because the commercial forces can be, in fact, stronger than the school books. Yeah. But I don't have an immediate answer to it.
Sorry.
So, I wonder on notion of articulation, which you actually articulated. So, and to play with that idea of the articulated track.
Yeah.
So, you see, the articulated track is neither the sum of its part and neither its part. So it's somewhere, let's say, in between, and also in a larger way to look at in the form idea of the assemblage, it actually is connected with all the consistency of the road and the nature and everything around it.
Yeah.
So in that way, every time the memory is articulated, re-articulated, or even to use the Tom Morrison idea, re-remembered, so then is it really the same memory, or is it a new memory which has been renewed again and renewed? So to go this loop of the re-remembering, then so is there any authentication in it? Is there any, let's say, trajectory in it, or just we have to look at the dialectical method of formation of memory?
Yeah.
And then as a memory scholars, then where and when in the life of memory, I don't like the term thriving of the memory, but in the life of memory, where do you call it memory? From where do you start calling it memory? Okay. Is it art discursive production, or is something you are taking it from the people in the back in society?
Okay. There's a lot of questions there, so let me see if I can... Yes, the question, memory is, there's no memory if it's not being remembered, right? So there has to be somebody doing doing the remembering, otherwise it's storage, it's information which is stored, right? So it's linked to the fact that somebody has, I often use the example of, it's like a swimmer. A swimmer has to keep moving or else she'll sink. In a sense, the memory disappears if you don't keep moving. If people are not picking it up and reproducing it in some way, either because they're thinking of it or because they're writing or whatever. So I don't have any problem with the idea that memory is always on the move, because it's something which it's information which is being transmitted. Somebody who's interested in the quality of what's being transmitted from a historian's perspective, of course it's very important to know if what's being transmitted is a fault, is an invention or not. But that's a different set of questions. I think that from the perspective of the transmission, yes, it's fine by me that it's always moving. And if there's a trajectory to it, yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to map out here as an issue that we need to examine more closely is where does it go and where does it not go, and what does not move, what stops, what's not being picked up. That is as important as what is being picked up, but I couldn't make any general statement on what the trajectory is.
Let me just ask, okay. But then if you go the same and a simple they ask Aristotle basically if the master carpenter is sleeping, is he a carpenter? No, basically. So the question was that the people who are actually doing the carpentry work are the carpenters. And he said, say, this is basically ridiculous because he is just sleeping. So you are basically disregarding the very fact that memory by itself, if it's archived, if it's not used, if it's not accessed, it still is a memory. So you are just basically denying the objective quality of memory regardless of people.
No, I think I would go along with Aleida Asselmann, who distinguishes between Speichergedächtnis and Funktionsgedächtnis. And the Speichergedächtnis is a storage, it's there as a potential memory. And it may be a former memory, but if as long as it's being ignored and nobody's doing anything with the information, then it's potential or it's stored memory. There, I think we might agree. But it's not functioning, it's not part of the working memory. Maybe that would be a way of resolving this dilemma of the sleeping carpenter.
Maybe.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of trivial informations to your wonderful articulation of articulation. And the first one is the Przybyszewska, the Sprawa. She was a writer. Actually, she admired the Robespierre instead of Danton, but the Andrzej Wajda's film is seemingly evidently puts a favor of Danton, right? So, I mean, that this heterogeneous remembrance exists also depending on people. The same pose, but in the Przybyszewska and Andrzej Wajda has different remembrance. Also, in an interview with the Polish press, Andrzej Wajda explained his motivation of making Danton. He was very deeply involved in the Solidarność movement in 1980, and he could witness different, activists, different revolutionaries, and sense that as a reflection over his experience in the Solidarność movement, he could feel he went back to the French Revolution. So I'm still wondering whom he had in mind for Robespierre among the Solidarity movement activists, but this Solidarity movement is also involved in the Andrzej Wajda's Danton. This is first. Second one is about the transposition one. And do you know who is the most famous, most popular French writer in East Asia? This is Alphonse Daudet. Alphonse Daudet is, he has a family connection with Action Française. But his short stories of the last lesson, which they carries very strong linguistic nationalism. It was translated into Japanese and was published in the national language textbook in the Imperial Japan before the Second World War. But even after the Second World War, the Japanese national language textbook still carries translation of Alphonse Daudet, but not only in Japan, in South Korea and Taiwan. His story was also translated into Korean and Chinese, and it was published in the national language textbooks in the post-colonial Korea and the post-colonial Taiwan. So this Alphonse Daudet is a very strange story of being popular in East Asia. So I think it's a very good indication to show how the transposition of memories or transposition of different linguistic heritages works out from one region to other region.
Sometimes oddly, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Anne, for the wonderful lecture. I really like your concepts, and especially the communication network, and easily connect us to the discussion on the regions of memory. But I wanted to ask a very generic question, and I'm sure you have answered it so many times that it would be easy for you. what distinction do you make between memory, knowledge, and narrative in your research? Because we very easily get conflated with them, especially when we try to trace the global flows, transnational flows, and then the narrative. Well, obviously the narrative is a way of putting out the memories, of phrasing them out, but sometimes maybe it's just a narrative, or maybe we should speak of knowledge, not memory anymore. So that's my question.
Oh, that's a difficult question, right? But a very fundamental one, and I think I could maybe answer it fairly straightforwardly. I mean, for me, narrative is memory is always articulated as narrative. Not all narratives are memory, but memory is always articulated as narrative. And in fact, my own studies came out of, I began as a narratologist, as somebody who was interested fundamentally in storytelling. So and that was always probably evident in my talk. So for me, memory is articulated as narrative. But it's what makes one narrative, what makes some narratives memory narratives and not just narratives, has to do with this belief that they correspond, that the state of affairs which is being narrated or depicted, that state of affairs corresponds to something which was actually the case, right? It has to do with the belief in its historicity, which is different from the fact that it is true or false, but there's a sense that it's narrative plus truthfulness. And Andre Husen talks about an imagined past, right? That in the sense that memory is an imagined past. And so knowledge then it depends on whether you're defining it as somebody who is an actor, right? And who then, on the basis, for example, of that television series on which I mentioned, North and South, the American television series, believes they have knowledge of the Civil War. People can believe they have knowledge as an actor, whereas from the perspective of a historian, you'll say, actually, that's just misinformation, right? So I think the word knowledge is a concept which will depend on what position you take, but from if you like the actor's perspective, a memory narrative is a form of knowledge. Yeah, I think I've answered. I saw somebody over there with a big
What distinguishes the two, you then said, was combination of narrative plus truthfulness, right? Now, if I have a narrative about, say, the extinction of the dinosaurs, I believe it to be true, but I wouldn't say I remember it. So I would suggest there is actually a third component, which is some form of identification with the narrative. And that's what makes or breaks memory studies, I'd suggest.
Identification with the narrative,
Yes, I mean, you can only say I remember it, whether you're talking of a community or an individual, if it in some way connects with you. Now, there are many narratives about the past whose truthfulness you might accept, but you wouldn't call them in any sense memories.
I think it's an excellent suggestion in terms of thinking about when do we use the word I remember. And indeed, when it comes to the question of cultural memory, that notion of that sort of a memory which has to do with, which relates to the experience of the group with which you identify, we wouldn't use the word I remember. And I think it would be really interesting to see when do we use the word I remember. And I think you're absolutely right. We do it for the things that we believe that had to do with our own experience. At the same time, we do talk about we call upon a cultural reservoir of, we would say, I remember, that's what was in that book, right? That's related to our personal experience. And I think it would be interesting to think about at what point then, what other sorts of words do you use to describe your evocation of a past which you believe to have been the case, and with which you identify to the extent that you say this is a relevant past. And I don't, it's hard to imagine dinosaurs as being quite a relevant path, unless you begin to think of it in sort of terms of the Anthropocene and so on. But I think so that it's conceivable might get to that point, but right now it's not part of a past which is linked to identity constructions. And I think that may be an issue here in terms of how do we define this cultural memory as being linked to this it's a story which also has a certain element of normativity in relation to what you think is important to be remembered, not just because you experienced it, but because it's part of what you think other people should remember and people in the future should also remember. So, but I'd have to think very much about what sort of words I would use to say that. Yeah.
Yes. I will be the next person to thank for your lecture. I will add another component to make the next distinction. You mentioned a lot of movies and different examples connected with art. What is the point when you differentiate a certain form of art as a narrative which we can believe to be true or not, and a form of art which mostly consists of some aesthetical values and is circulating not because of the narrative, but because of many other reasons, as very often movies do. I'll just come quickly with one example. Ida, quite famous Polish movie, which on one hand tells the story which is very important for the memory, and on the other hand, it can circulate around the world and be watched only because of the photographs and aesthetical value of this movie. So, is the problem in your research, and if yes, what is the distinction you're making?
That's a very difficult one and raises the question of sort of different audiences and different expectations and different levels of investment. And this may be relevant to our whole discussion of regions of memory, the notion of what are the horizon of expectations of a particular public being exposed to a particular movie. It's also related to what they already know. So I think we couldn't make a general answer as to how, you can't say the story when it travels abroad that it will be seen merely as art. On the contrary, it's often seen particularly as truth. Right? The farther you get away from knowledge, the closer people then take these art forms as knowledge. So, but there's a space in between where you have groups who actually know something about the topic and then can be completely outraged by certain representations too. And in other cases, and adopt different sort of critical distances. But I think it's just the proof of the pudding is in the eating, they say. In the same way, the proof of the historical movie is in how people react to it. And some movies will be seen as, read as either just not relevant with a sense of disbelief. But I think more often what happens is that from a certain exoticism, and I think that's something we have to, perhaps I could have brought out in my talk a bit more, certainly this hetero-remembrance can also be linked with exoticism. Somebody else's history is a really exciting history, but thank God it's not mine. They had to go through all sorts of terrible struggles and stuff, and I can now watch it and I can see it and I can sympathize with them, but it's not mine. So there is an element of exoticization which can come into other people's stories. So there's a whole range there of different types of movie, but also different types of receptions, and I think we just need to be able to map it a bit better.
Just one more question.
Thank you, Nid, for a very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you ever thought about the way how concepts which are borrowed from one context and brought into the articulation of the memory discourse or narrative concerned with one particular issue, how it affects the perception of the memory, for example, enforcing some sort of criminalization of the past which was not considered as criminal before. So how putting in line several different events taking place in different time and regions, how it mutually influences the perception of what actually happened.
Could you give me have you an example in mind?
Well, for example, how, referring to the example which already was used today from the transnational memory by Ruthberg, how, for example, the concept of Holocaust was kind of borrowed and revoked in the memory of slavery, or, for example, the concept of genocide becomes more and more involved into thinking about this post-communist or communist repression, so in post-communist memory. So how does it affect? It actually brings sometimes the degree of criminalization or degree of criminality. So it kind of affects the level of perception and the concept of what happened.
Right, yeah, yeah. I mean, the whole question of the sort of the devalorization of the word genocide and the word trauma, for example, is something that I think we have to look very closely and critically at. I mean, the ways in which terms can be used and misused. So I think that's something that we have to deal with, right? In the sort of whole sort of competition, victimhood, competition for victimhood, this is where this sort of issue comes in. And I think that's, you know, that's the question of this agonism, which is in memory cultures, which is a different version of this. I was talking about articulations and the point of making new types of connections. There's also another version of this, which is the sort of the agonistic version of these sort of imports, right? And I think that's where this question of the sort of the question of comparison is always a very fraught one, right? And this is where the downside, perhaps, of there's both an upside and a downside. Is what you might call a global memory discourse, which is linked to a global human rights discourse. The sort of ways in which words are traveling, and sometimes they can be used in a very enlightening way. I mean, I think the idea of the disappeared, which is, I think, begins as a sort of a correct me if I'm wrong here. You were in South America, but I think it begins in Argentina. And you find it now used in Spain, but you also find it used in Northern Ireland, and it becomes this sort of concept for the disappeared, becomes this concept which provides this type of articulations between different situations, which in some ways are not comparable, but in other ways they are. And this type of, the availability of these types of transnational concepts, I think it's also, in the first instance, a liberation from the narrowness of where you only have one word for your own story, where your own story is dictated by the words you have for it. Having access to other types of vocabularies is a way of revealing and showing and creating understanding also of your own story. And that's what I think is the basic notion of multidirectionality. The fact that in some cases it also leads to an inflation, if you like, and sort of unjustifiable comparison is a fact, but I think then we have to think not so much about, okay, well, therefore ban it. No, you have to therefore then see how can you find a way of engaging with it critically to begin this discussion of comparison, because I think behind our whole discussion today is the issue of comparison. And what sort of comparisons can be made, and when is comparison something which gives critical insight, and when is comparison something which simply fudges major differences. Please join me in thanking Ann for this wonderful discussion. Thank you. Thank you.